She was 8 months pregnant, standing in her husband's closet, holding a note that wasn't hers. 4 words on cream-colored paper. Meet me at 8. No name, no date, no explanation. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't call him a single name. She folded the note back, exactly as she found it, set it on the shelf, and then she started thinking. Because here is what her billionaire husband forgot. He forgot that the woman he asked to give up her law career still remembered every single thing she learned in it. He forgot that the woman he asked to stay home, stay quiet, stay small, had been at 25 the sharpest legal mind her professor had seen in 20 years of teaching. He forgot that when you spend 7 years making someone invisible, you don't make them weak. You just make them patient. And she had been very, very patient. He left her, 8 months pregnant, for his 26-year-old employee. He had a prenuptial agreement, 3 hidden properties, an offshore account, a mother who knew, a sister who helped, and a best friend who stayed silent. He thought he had thought of everything. He hadn't thought of her. This is the story of a woman who didn't beg, didn't break, didn't disappear. This is the story of what she took instead. Stay with me, because what happens next, you won't see coming. This story is for every woman who was ever told she was too much and spent years making herself too little. What Caroline Adler does next is not just a story. It is a reminder that the person they underestimated most was always you. If this story speaks to something inside you, something you have been waiting to hear, stay until the end. Because the most important part is not what she took. It is what she found. And if you believe every woman deserves to hear a story like this, please like this video, leave a comment below telling us what part hit you hardest, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story that reminds you of who you actually are.
The closet smelled like cedar and dry cleaning fluid. Caroline noticed that every time she came in here. The siege blocks she replaced every 6 months. The dry cleaning fluid that clung to Grant's jackets no matter how long they hung. She moved slowly. 8 months pregnant, you move slowly whether you want to or not. The baby pressed against her ribs from the inside. A steady, deliberate pressure. Like a reminder. It was a Tuesday evening in March. The kind of cold that gets inside the walls of even a very expensive house. Caroline had been on her feet since 8 that morning, and her lower back had been sending quiet complaints for the last 2 hours. She just wanted to hang the jackets and sit down. Grant's dry cleaning had come back that afternoon. 4 suits, 2 dress shirts, 1 overcoat. She lifted the first jacket off the plastic and reached for the hanger. Her hand found the pocket. She didn't know why she checked it. She didn't make a habit of going through his pockets. It was just instinct. The same instinct that made her check the stove twice before leaving the house. The same instinct that made her very good once in a courtroom. Her fingers closed around paper. She pulled it out, cream-colored, heavy stock. The kind that costs $15 a sheet. She knew this because she ordered household stationery from the same supplier. Had been ordering it for 6 years. This was not their stationery. The note was folded once. She opened it. 4 words, meet me at 8. No name, no date, no explanation. She read it once, she read it again. She stood very still in the cedar and dry cleaning closet and read it a 3rd time, looking for a different meaning in the same 4 words. There wasn't one. That's her handwriting, she thought. I don't know how I know that, but I do. She folded the note back exactly as she found it, set it on the shelf, walked to the bathroom. The marble floor was cold through her socks. The exhaust fan hummed. The light above the mirror buzzed slightly. It had been buzzing for 2 weeks, and she kept forgetting to mention it to the building manager. She turned on the cold tap, ran water over her wrists, a habit from law school, a trick for thinking clearly under pressure. She looked at herself in the mirror, 32 years old, 8 months pregnant, standing in a bathroom that cost more than her parents' house, holding a note that just broke everything. She did not drop it. She did not cry. She breathed. Her mind went to work the way it always did under pressure. Not with panic, with inventory, the things she had noticed and filed away. Grant coming home late, 4 nights out of 7 for the past 3 months. His phone face down on every surface, every table, every counter, every nightstand. A new gym bag that appeared one Thursday and was never explained. A business trip to Austin that produced no client, no contract, no follow-up. The way he stopped touching her when she started showing. Not abruptly, gradually. The way water recedes from a shore slowly enough that you tell yourself it's the tide. The way he looked at her lately. Not with distance, with something worse, with decision. I told myself it was stress, she thought. The acquisition, the board restructuring. I told myself 100 reasonable things. I am a former corporate attorney. I know what evidence looks like. I chose not to see it. She heard the front door. Grant was home. She checked her phone. His last text had come 2 hours ago. Running late, don't wait up. She read it once, read it again, read it a third time, looking for something different in the same 11 words. She locked the screen, unlocked it, locked it again, set the phone on the bathroom counter and looked at it, picked it up, set it down. Stop, she told herself. She walked to the top of the staircase. Grant was in the front hall below. He was hanging his coat on the hook by the door. He did not look up. He did not call her name. He went directly to his office and closed the door behind him. She stood at the top of the stairs and counted to 60. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea she would not drink. She waited until she heard him in the shower. 20 minutes. Long enough. She went to the kitchen counter where he had left his phone to charge. She knew his passcode. 6 digits. Their anniversary. She had always known it. She had never used it without permission. She used it now. Her hands were steady. That surprised her somewhere in the back of her mind. Her hands were completely steady. The messages were not hidden. They were not hidden because Grant never expected her to look. He had made a calculation about her. A specific calculation. That she was a woman who trusted, not a woman who checked. He was half right. She was both. He had only counted one. The conversation thread was listed under a single initial, V. She scrolled up. The messages went back 9 months. 9 months. Their daughter had been growing inside her for 9 months. She read 3 messages. That was enough. She didn't need more. She had been a litigator. She knew when the case was made. She screenshot nothing. She remembered everything. First year of practice, her supervising partner had told her, the moment you take the document, they know you have it. Wait, build, then move. She put the phone back exactly as she found it, plugged it back in at the exact angle it had been before. Then she went back upstairs. She drew a bath she did not get into. She sat on the edge of the tub in her clothes and listened to the water run. The tap dripped, one slow drop at a time. She placed both hands on her belly. Her name is going to be Henny, she thought. We already decided that. He already knows her name. He has known her name since before she was born, and he has been meeting another woman at 8 o'clock in the evening. She did not cry. She breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Her therapist had taught her that. Back in the first year of the marriage, when life moved so fast, she sometimes forgot to exhale. She breathed and she began to think. Not about feelings, about steps. He made a mistake, she thought. Not because he had an affair, because he had one while married to a woman who used to do discovery for a living, and he forgot what that meant. She heard his footsteps in the hallway. The office door had opened. His steps came down the hall. They stopped outside the bedroom door. A long pause. Then they continued. Down the hall, to the guest room. He did not even try anymore. She turned off the bathroom light. She walked to the bed in the dark. She lay down on her side, one hand under her cheek, one hand on her belly. Good, she thought. Neither will I. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time, but she was not afraid. She was planning. She was up at 5:30. The baby had pressed against a nerve sometime around 4, and sleep became impossible after that. She padded downstairs in wool socks and her old law school sweatshirt, the one she kept for exactly these mornings, gray, worn soft at the elbows. She made decaf, sat at the kitchen island, opened her laptop. She had a name by 9 o'clock. It took her 4 hours. She did not go back to his phone. She worked from what she had, the area code of the number she had memorized. The timestamps early morning, late evening, the pattern of someone following a work schedule. The references in 3 messages she had read before she looked away. The Meridian account. The Singapore presentation. Weston Capital Group employed 900 people. She searched the company website, the leadership page, the team directory. She was methodical. She went through every department. Brand development. Head of brand development. She joined the firm 14 months ago. Her bio listed a Dartmouth MBA and previous experience at a New York firm, passionate about authentic brand narratives. Authentic, Caroline thought. She stared at the photograph. Young. Polished. A smile that had been practiced until it looked natural. Dark hair. Professional headshot against a neutral background. She's 26, Caroline thought. And then, slowly, she's 26 years old and she's working for my husband, and I need to understand what this actually is before I decide what to do about it. She called Sandra Pruitt at 10:15. Sandra had been referred by a law school colleague 3 years ago, mentioned in passing at a reunion. Caroline had kept the name in a note on her phone. She hadn't known why at the time. She knew why now. Sandra answered on the second ring. Sandra Pruitt Investigations, she said. My name is Caroline Weston, Caroline said. I was referred by David Marsh. I need 2 weeks of documentation. I can do that, Sandra said. What am I documenting? My husband, his movements, his meetings, who he sees and when. A pause. And I need one additional thing. What's that? I need to know if she knows he's married. A brief silence. Most clients don't ask that, Sandra said. Most clients aren't attorneys, Caroline replied. The file came back in 48 hours. It was thorough. Sandra Pruitt was thorough. Dates and times and locations and photographs and a 17-page supplemental financial analysis that Caroline had not asked for but recognized immediately as a gift. She read it in the nursery. The nursery was the only room in the house that felt entirely hers. She had chosen every piece of it, the white crib, the oak rocking chair, the mobile with the hand-painted birds, the pale yellow walls the exact shade of morning light. She sat in the rocking chair and read. The documentation was clear and damning and more than sufficient. But it was the section at the end that changed everything. Under additional notes, Sandra had included a summary of a letter. Vivian Hale had sent it to Grant's personal email address 3 months ago. Not the secondary address, his actual name address. Sandra had accessed it through a document Grant had inadvertently left in a cloud folder. Legal. Just barely. In the letter, Vivian had asked Grant to tell her the truth about his marriage. She wrote that he had told her he and Caroline were, quote, separated in every meaningful way, living together only for the pregnancy. She wrote that she had believed him, that she was no longer certain she should. She asked him directly, is she really okay with this? Does she know? Grant had never responded to the email. He had simply continued. He lied to her too, Caroline thought. She set the file down on her knee. He told her I knew. He told her I was fine with it. He built her a story the same way he built mine. Selective, curated, comfortable for everyone involved except the person being managed. She asked him directly. He said nothing. She's not my enemy. She's evidence. She closed the file. Grant passed through the kitchen at 7 the next morning. Suit, tie, briefcase. The performance of a successful man. You were up early, he said. Couldn't sleep, she said. He poured his coffee, checked his phone. Left, Caroline watched him go. She wiped the kitchen counter. She wiped it again. She moved to the stovetop, to the refrigerator handles, to the window above the sink. The cloth was already dry. Her hands needed something to do while her mind worked. This is what I do, she thought, when something large is about to happen. I order the small things. She wrung out the cloth, hung it over the sink. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a name she had not called in 4 years, Professor Daniel Holt. Evidence law. The man who had once told her she had the sharpest strategic mind he'd seen in 20 years of teaching. She had thanked him, slightly embarrassed. She had not known what to do with that kind of assessment. She knew now. She left a message. She said she needed a referral. The best divorce attorney in Massachusetts. He called back within the hour. Marcus Ford, he said. Don't tell him I sent you. He'll charge me. She was in the nursery that evening when Grant knocked on the open door. She had not heard him come up the stairs. Caroline, he said, we should talk. There are some things I need to say to you. His voice was almost kind. That particular kind of kindness that precedes a difficult announcement a person has already decided to make. She knew that voice. She had heard it in boardrooms and depositions, and exactly once from her father, standing in a hospital hallway, preparing to tell her something she already knew. She looked at Grant across the room. I know, she said. He blinked. Just once. The first time she had ever seen him look uncertain. Good, she said. She turned back to the window. But not tonight. Tonight, I'm tired. She heard him stand there for a moment. Then she heard him leave. Downstairs, his voice was low and careful and directed at his phone. She put in her earbuds. She put on the playlist she'd made for labor preparation. Slow songs. Familiar ones. She slept better than she had in months. I'm not imagining this, she thought, just before she drifted off. I know what I saw, and I know exactly what it means. 2 days later, she drove to Brookline. Eleanor Weston's house was a 6-bedroom Tudor on a street lined with old trees, the kind of house that had been beautiful for so long it had forgotten it was trying. Everything about it was intentional. The boxwood hedges trimmed to military precision, the iron knocker on the front door, the brass house numbers that were just slightly larger than necessary. Caroline pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. She sat. The clock on the dash read 10:47. She did not move. Not nervous, she told herself. Just waiting. She was waiting for the right version of herself to walk in, not the Caroline who had spent 6 years learning to smile at this house. Not the Caroline who had attended 40 Sunday dinners in that formal dining room and thanked Eleanor for the flowers and nodded when Eleanor described, in exquisite detail, how Grant had been as a child. A different version, the one she used to be. At 10:58, she got out of the car. Eleanor met her in the front hall. Cream cashmere cardigan, gardenias. Always gardenias. A scent Caroline had associated with quiet judgment for 6 years. Eleanor kissed her on both cheeks and looked at her belly with an expression calibrated to be warm. "You look wonderful," Eleanor said. "Come in, I'll make tea." "Just water," Caroline said. "I'm not here to stay long." They sat in the formal living room, the room no one in the family actually lived in. Cream sofas, antique side tables, a mantel clock that ticked with a sound like a small, patient accusation. Caroline set her bag on her knee. "I know about Vivian Hale," she said. She did not preface it. She did not approach it carefully. There was no useful approach. The only useful thing was the fact itself, placed in the center of the room. Eleanor set her teacup down. "Caroline, I'm not angry with you," Caroline said. "I need to know the timeline. For legal reasons, how long have you known?" Not a question. A request for information. Eleanor looked at her. Eleanor was very good at looking directly at things. It was, Caroline had come to understand, the Weston family's primary defense mechanism. They looked directly at what they had done. They simply did not apologize for it. "About a year," Eleanor said. "Give or take." The word fell into the room like a stone into water. A year. "Grant came to me," Eleanor continued. "He told me there was someone. He said the marriage had been difficult, that you two had grown apart. He told you that while I was pregnant." "And you said what?" Eleanor's hands were very still in her lap. "I told him to be discreet," she said. "I told him to handle his personal matters privately." Caroline did not look away. "You told him to be discreet," she repeated, "while his wife was carrying his child." "Caroline, I was trying to what?" Silence. The clock ticked. The room smelled like gardenias and money, choices made on behalf of someone who was never consulted. Not just Grant, Caroline thought. A whole system. A whole architecture of protection built around him, around what he needed, what was convenient for him. "I married into a family, and the family decided, without asking me, without once considering that I might have standing in my own marriage." She already knew about Brooke before she came here. Sandra's file had placed Brooke at 3 of Grant and Vivian's meeting locations. Not as a witness. As a facilitator. Restaurant reservations booked on Brooke's personal account. A key to the Cambridge apartment held in Brooke's name. The apartment itself was the detail that mattered most. It appeared nowhere in Grant's financial disclosures. It had been registered through a subsidiary LLC, WC7, named in the same convention Grant used for all his holding companies, a letter and a number. Caroline knew this because she had filed his quarterly disclosures for 3 years, at his request. To help him stay organized, he said, he needed me to know his systems. She understood now. Not because I was a partner, because I was useful. And then, when I stopped being useful the way he needed, he adjusted. She looked at Eleanor. "The prenuptial agreement," she said. "Your family's attorney drafted the asset protection clause?" Eleanor straightened slightly. "That was a standard provision. Did your family's attorney draft it?" A pause. "Yes." Caroline nodded. She stood. She picked up her bag. "I'll need his name," she said. "He'll be receiving a conflict of interest notification from my attorney within the week." Eleanor stood as well. "Your attorney?" "Yes. You've retained someone." "I retained someone 4 days ago." Eleanor looked at her. For the first time in 6 years, something shifted in Eleanor's face. Not regret, exactly. Something more like recalibration. The recognition that the situation was different from the one she had modeled. Caroline walked to the front door. At the threshold, she turned back. "Eleanor, I don't hate you. I want to be clear about that. But I'm going to document this conversation. The timeline, everything you confirmed today, all of it will go to my attorney." "You recorded this? Massachusetts is a one-party consent state," Caroline said. "I am the one party." She opened the front door. The cold air hit her face, sharp and clean, like the first breath after being inside for too long. She walked to her car. She drove to the park where she used to run. Before the pregnancy made running impossible, she had run this loop 3 times a week, an hour in the early morning. Just her in the path and the sound of her own breathing. She parked facing the pond, turned off the engine. The radio came on by itself when she turned the key back, some song from college. Half remembered, a woman's voice. Low and familiar. She didn't change it. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the water. The pond was gray this time of year. Flat and honest. No pretense of beauty. Just water being water. She thought about a woman she had not thought about in a long time. Herself at 25, studying for the bar in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled like the Thai place downstairs, surviving on ambition and cheaper takeout than she would ever admit. A woman who had never heard of Grant Weston, who had never sat in a formal living room that smelled like judgment, who had never been described as so gracious by people who meant so manageable. I was someone before this, she thought. The baby kicked. Hard. Once. I know, Caroline thought. I know, Henny. I haven't forgotten. She put the car in drive. I deserve to be treated better than this, she said to the windshield. Her voice was quiet, but it was steady. My child deserves better than this, she said it once. She didn't need to say it twice. She pulled out of the park and drove home. That evening, her phone rang. D. She stared at the name, D. Callahan. 11 years. Law school orientation. The woman who had given the toast at her wedding that made the whole room cry, including the officiant. She knows something, Caroline thought. She has always known something. I can hear it in how quickly she calls when I've been upset about something. The speed of her checking in. She let it ring once more. Then she picked up. D, I need you to come over, tonight. And I need you to be honest with me. A long pause on the other end. When Dee finally spoke, her voice was quiet. None of the usual speed and volume and humor. Okay, she said. Just that. No joke, no deflection. Which was how Caroline knew she was right. Dee arrived at 7 with Thai food and sparkling water. She held the water up as she came through the door. An offering, an apology, a delay tactic. I didn't bring wine because you can't have any, she said. And I didn't bring wine for me because I'm not going to be the only one drinking. And I didn't bring anything else because I panicked in the parking lot for 6 minutes. This was Dee. The armor of humor. Caroline had loved this about her for 11 years. Tonight she saw it for what it also was. A way to fill the space before a hard thing had to be said. A way to be present without being arrived. They sat at the kitchen island. Caroline did not open the food. How long have you known? She said. Dee opened her mouth. Something moved across her face, the flicker of a deflection considered and rejected. About what specifically? She said. Don't, Caroline said. The word was not unkind. It was simply a closed door on a familiar avenue. Dee looked at the counter. About 8 months, she said, give or take. It came out slowly. Not because Dee was hiding. The hiding was over and they both knew it, but because she had rehearsed this conversation so many times in her head that the real version felt wrong. Too small, too simple. Not adequate to what it had cost both of them. 8 months ago, a fitness studio in Cambridge. Dee had been in the locker room after a Saturday morning class. A woman was talking to a mutual acquaintance, someone from Dee's workplace, who knew someone from the firm. The woman was talking about someone she was seeing, wonderful but complicated, not quite available. Worth it. Dee had looked her up on LinkedIn that night, recognized the firm name, searched the company website, found Grant's photograph on the leadership page. I almost told you, Dee said, 100 times. I wrote texts, I deleted them. Why didn't you send them? Dee wrapped her hands around her water bottle. Because your whole life is built around this marriage, she said. The house, the pregnancy, everything. And I thought, what if I tell you and I'm wrong? What if I destroy everything and I'm wrong? And what if you were right, Caroline said. Which you were. I know. Then what you were actually scared of, Caroline said, was being right. Dee did not answer for a moment. She looked at the counter. She looked at Caroline. Something in her face that was part grief and part relief, and part the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a secret they should have put down months ago. Yeah, she said finally. Yeah, that's exactly it. This was the moment that broke Caroline more than finding the note. Not because Dee was more culpable. She was not. She was human and frightened and had made a choice that a lot of people would have made, but because Dee had known, and Eleanor had known, and Brooke had known. Everyone around her had been making decisions about what Caroline should and should not know about her own marriage. I was the exhibit, she thought. I was the one thing everyone was managing. Grant managing his exits. Eleanor managing the narrative. Brooke managing the logistics. Dee managing her own conscience. I was the last person in my own life to know what was happening in it. Not because I was weak. Because they all decided I needed to be protected from the truth. As if truth was the thing that would break me. Not the lie itself. The truth. She breathed. She looked at Dee. I don't blame you, she said. I mean that. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I mean it. You were scared. That's human. Dee looked up. But from now on, Caroline said, I need you to be the person who tells me. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Can you do that? Yes, Dee said. Immediately. No hesitation. Yes. Absolutely yes. All right, Caroline said. Then open the food. I'm starving. Dee left at 10:30. Caroline lay in bed and listened to the house settle. The creak of the third stair, the sound of the heat coming through the radiators. She thought about what she knew now. A husband conducting an affair of 9 months' duration. A mother-in-law who knew for a year and said nothing except be discreet. A sister-in-law who facilitated it with restaurant reservations and a copy of a key. A best friend who carried the secret for 8 months because she was scared of being right. All these people, she thought, all these people moving around me, managing me, deciding for me, and I was here the whole time. Present. Participating. Completely unaware. I was so busy keeping the peace that I made it permanent. She got up at 3:45 in the morning. She could not sleep. She didn't try to force it. She went to the nursery. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room in the dark. The mobile turned slowly in the draft from the hallway. The streetlight came through the curtains and caught the painted birds. Red, blue, yellow. She had chosen each one. She went to the dresser and began folding onesies that were already folded. She refolded them, set them in a different stack, moved them back. She rehung the mobile on its hook and adjusted the angle. She moved the rocking chair 3 inches to the left, looked at it, moved it back. She sat down in the chair, pulled out her phone. The screen showed her recent searches. Prenup loopholes, Massachusetts. Marital asset dissipation evidence. How to prove marital misconduct. Can you record conversations in Massachusetts? Cambridge apartment rental records public. How to hide that you have been crying. She stared at that last one. When did I add that, she thought. And she almost laughed. Almost! The way you almost laugh at something that is not funny, but is so precisely truthful laughter is the nearest response. She set the phone face down in the nursery drawer. Enough Google, she told herself. You have an attorney? Use him. She called Marcus Ford at 8 in the morning. She did not lead with emotion. She never had, in a professional context. It was one of the things she was best at. She led with documentation. The investigator's report, the Eleanor recording, the phone records Dee had inadvertently confirmed, the LLC registration, the preliminary financial analysis. She saved one thing for last. The Cambridge apartment, she said, he rented it 14 months ago through a subsidiary LLC. The registration is public record. He has been paying for it with company funds, running it as a client entertainment suite. That's commingling marital assets with corporate accounts. How did you locate the LLC? Marcus asked. He uses the same naming convention for all his holding companies, she said. A letter and a number. WC7. I filed his quarterly disclosures for 3 years. I know his patterns. A pause. She could hear Marcus thinking. A quiet, precise kind of thinking that she recognized from her own best moments. Ms. Weston, he said finally, I think you may have just made my job significantly easier. I know I have, she said. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible, she thought that evening, standing at the nursery window. That was not an accident, and it is not permanent. Marcus Ford suggested therapy the way he suggested everything. Without sentiment. With practical certainty. You're in the planning phase right now, he said. That feels like clarity. It is clarity, actually, but it won't last indefinitely. Give it 2 weeks, and you'll need somewhere to process this that isn't me, isn't your friend, and isn't your mother. I'm fine, Caroline said. Right now, yes, he said. Call Dr. Pamela Shore. Tell her I referred you. He said it like he was recommending a good structural engineer. The tone of someone who had seen what happened when people tried to carry this alone. She called Dr. Shore. The office was in Back Bay, 2nd floor of a brownstone, white walls and good light, and a single plant on the windowsill that looked unreasonably healthy. A rubber plant. Big dark leaves, thriving in a way that felt slightly pointed. Dr. Shore was in her mid-40s, brown hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She shook Caroline's hand and gestured to a chair that was comfortable without being aggressively comfortable. Tell me what's happening, she said. Caroline told her. All of it. Concise and sequential. The note, the phone, Sandra's file, Eleanor, the LLC, Dee, Marcus, 8 months pregnant and rebuilding her legal strategy from a nursery rocking chair at 3:45 in the morning. Dr. Shore listened without interrupting, without nodding in that performed therapist way. She just listened. When Caroline finished, there was a brief silence. Then Dr. Shore asked one question. When did you first know the marriage was in trouble? 8 months ago, when the messages, not when you found evidence. When did you first know? In your body. Before your mind agreed to it. Caroline opened her mouth. She closed it. A long silence. When, she thought. When? Our first year, she said quietly. Maybe. Tell me about the first year. She had not told this story to anyone. Not fully. She had told pieces of it, the broad strokes, the presentable version. The full version was something she had packed away, carefully and deliberately, and placed somewhere she would not have to look at it regularly. The first year. They had gotten engaged 6 months after meeting. The wedding took 12 months to plan and appeared in 3 publications. It was, by every external measure, extraordinary. During the engagement, Grant had suggested she take a leave from the firm just for the wedding planning. There was so much to manage, she had agreed. 12 months felt finite, manageable. After the wedding, she had begun inquiring about returning. Grant had been careful. He never said don't. He never forbade anything. That would have been legible. That would have been something she could have identified and argued against. He said, of course, if that's what you want. Although with the move and the new house, it might be a lot. 6 months later. I thought you were happy here. Are you not happy? A year after that, the firm in Boston doesn't have a position at your level. You'd have to start over. Is that really worth it at this point? At this point. As if time passing had been her decision. As if waiting had been her choice. Did you believe him? Dr. Shore asked. I believed that it was more complicated than I wanted it to be, Caroline said. I told myself that was wisdom. Was it? A pause. It was easier than fighting, she said. Every objection had a reasonable answer. Every concern had a counter-argument. I kept waiting for a moment where the answer would be clearly wrong. And it never was. Each one was just plausible enough. So you stopped objecting. I stopped objecting. And then it wasn't a question anymore. The leave became permanent, the career became past tense. The woman I had been became a reference point. She looked at the plant on the windowsill. He didn't take anything from me that I didn't hand over, she said. One small concession at a time, one of course, and whatever you think, and I suppose that makes sense. 7 years of small surrenders. What do you think that cost you? Dr. Shore asked. A long silence. Everything I am, Caroline said. And then, once it was gone, nothing at all, because I had stopped noticing it was missing. Dr. Shore did not say, he manipulated you. She did not offer the label. The label was Caroline's to find or not find in her own time. She said, you had a pattern of expertise, law, strategy, evidence, precision. You put it in storage. What do you think happens to a capability when it isn't used? It doesn't disappear, Caroline said slowly. No, what happens to it? It waits. Yes. Caroline looked at the plant again. It waits, she said, like a held breath. And when you finally exhale, she thought about the closet, the note, the phone. Eleanor's face. The deposition she was already preparing for. It turns out, she said, I've been holding it for 7 years. And you're breathing now. Yes, she said, I'm breathing now. Dr. Shore asked one more question before the session ended. What do you want? Not from the divorce, not from the settlement, not for your daughter. For yourself, as a person. Caroline opened her mouth. She closed it. She had not been asked this question in a very long time. It was possible she had never been asked it and actually answered it. I want to practice law again, she said. I want to be in a courtroom. I want the kind of days where I'm so useful that I forget to eat lunch. She paused. I want to be the kind of mother my daughter looks at and thinks she has her own life. A real one, so I can have mine. Another pause. I want to stop performing calm and actually feel it. Those are 3 things, Dr. Shore said. Yes. They're all achievable. They were always achievable. What blocked them? Caroline thought. A very specific set of decisions made by other people, she said, and a very specific set of decisions I made to accommodate them. And now? She straightened. Something in her spine that was not new quite but felt like it was. Now I make different decisions. She left Dr. Shore's office and walked to her car. The afternoon light was flat and cold and absolutely clear. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, just feeling the cold air. Starting over feels impossible, she said quietly. To herself, to the street, to no one particular. A pause. But staying was already killing me. She got in the car. She called Marcus Ford. I'm ready, she said. For what specifically, he asked. All of it. A pause. Then we file Monday, he said. Be fair he does. That matters strategically. I know it does, she said. I know exactly why. She could hear the slight change in his voice. Just barely. The professional equivalent of a raised eyebrow. You really did used to be an attorney, he said. I still am, she said. As of this morning, I reactivated my license. Monday morning, 9:04. Marcus filed the petition for divorce at the Suffolk County Courthouse. The document cited marital misconduct, asset dissipation through corporate commingling, evidence of a sustained extramarital relationship of 9 months confirmed duration. Caroline was in the nursery. She was on her laptop, sending documents to Marcus as he needed them. The investigator's report, the Eleanor recording, timestamped and transcribed, the LLC registration pulled from public records. A 17-page financial analysis she had produced over the weekend, a breakdown of every asset Grant had attempted to shelter through the subsidiary structure. She had worked on it Saturday and Sunday while Grant was, as far as she knew, at the Cambridge apartment. She had worked on it at the kitchen island, at the nursery desk, in bed with pillows propped behind her back. She had been methodical. She had been thorough. She had been, for the first time in years, entirely herself. Marcus called at 9:15. "The opposing attorney just called me," he said. "That was fast. He's very unhappy. He wants to know where you obtained the LLC information." "Public record," she said. "That's what I told him." "And?" "He asked whether you have a law degree." "You can tell him yes," she said, "and that I reactivated my license last Thursday, and that I am assisting in my own case in an advisory capacity." A pause. "I love my job," Marcus said. Grant came home at noon. He came through the front door and went directly to the kitchen. He was not angry. He was something worse, controlled, the board meeting version of himself, the version that had been trained to manage difficult situations without visible disruption. "Caroline," he said, "let's be reasonable about this." "I am being reasonable," she said. "I'm being extremely precise, which is different. The prenup protects the assets I held prior to the marriage. You know that. It's ironclad. It has a misconduct exception," she said. "You know that too. Your family's attorney drafted it." "I spoke to him on Friday. He was very forthcoming about the original drafting intent." Grant stared at her. "You called our family's attorney." "He's no longer your family's attorney," she said. "He withdrew from the matter Friday afternoon. Conflict of interest. He also confirmed the conversation your mother had with him 14 months ago." Grant sat down in the kitchen chair. For the first time in 6 years, he did not look like a man with a plan. He looked like a man who had reached for something that wasn't where he left it. "Carolyn, I'm going to need you to leave for the afternoon," she said. "I have a prenatal appointment at 2. He looked at her, something working behind his eyes that she had never seen before. "I underestimated you," he said. The words came out almost involuntarily. She could tell he had not intended to say them. She looked at him. "Most people do," she said. "Once." He left at 12:20. At 1:47 in the afternoon, her water broke. She was standing at the kitchen counter reading the financial affidavit her attorney had just sent for review. She felt the shift. She knew immediately what it was. She set down the document. She called Dee. "Now," Dee said. "Now," she said. "I'm 12 minutes away." "I know," she called her mother. "Mom," she said. "It's time." Ruth Adler had been staying at a hotel 3 miles away for 2 weeks. She had arrived, said nothing dramatic, unpacked her bag, and made herself available. That was how Ruth did things. She showed up and waited. "I'm getting my coat," Ruth said. Then Caroline called a car service. Then she went upstairs and got her hospital bag, which had been packed for 3 weeks and sitting by the bedroom door, because she was that kind of person. She walked past the guest room where Grant had been sleeping. She did not stop. Dee arrived in 11 minutes. She came through the door and looked at Caroline with a look that was trying to be calm and was mostly succeeding. "How far apart?" she said. 8 minutes, Caroline said. "We have time. Do you need anything? I need you to stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm about to break." Dee took a breath. "Right," she said. "You're not going to break." "No," Caroline said. "I'm really not." Ruth arrived 20 minutes later, still in her coat, slightly out of breath from running from the car. She did not say anything dramatic. She walked in, took Caroline's hand, and stood quietly. That was exactly what Caroline needed. Dee looked at Caroline from across the room. "I never liked him," she said. "I should say it while I can. I never liked any of it." Caroline was in the middle of a contraction. Not the worst one yet, but a real one. She almost laughed. Almost. "I know," she said. "I know you didn't. I should have said it years ago." "Yes," Caroline said, "but you're saying it now." Ruth squeezed her hand, said nothing. The baby pressed downward. "Here we go," Caroline thought. "Here we go, Henny. Here we actually go." Grant was in the waiting room. He had arrived at the hospital an hour after them. He sat in the waiting room and he waited. He was not asked into the delivery room. He did not fight this. Caroline was aware, somewhere in the back of her mind, of the significance of that. He had the right to be present. She had not prevented him from asserting it. He had simply not asserted it. "He doesn't know what to do," she thought, in a quiet moment between contractions. "For the first time in our marriage, he genuinely doesn't know what to do. Because I'm not the variable he prepared for." She did not think about Grant again for several hours. She had other things to think about. At 11:41 that night, Henny was born. 7 pounds, 1 ounce, dark hair. Eyes still working out what color they planned to be. The nurse placed her on Caroline's chest. She was warm and small and absolutely specific. She was not a baby in general. She was this a particular baby. with this particular face, with a small furrow between her eyebrows that suggested opinions. There you are, Caroline thought. She pressed her lips to the top of Henny's head, breathed in. I have been waiting for you for longer than you know. Ruth was crying silently in the corner. She was doing it in the specific way of someone who has decided not to cry, but has lost the argument with herself. Dee had given up on the pretense entirely and was sitting in the chair with her knees pulled up, crying fully and making no apology for it. Caroline held her daughter. The monitors beeped softly. The hallway sounds were distant. The room was very quiet in the way rooms sometimes are in the middle of the night, when something important has just happened and the world has not caught up yet. Everything I'm about to do, Caroline thought, I'm going to do with you watching. And you will never have a reason to be ashamed of me. That is the only promise that actually matters. 6 weeks. 6 weeks since Henny was born. 6 weeks since the hospital. 5.5 weeks since Caroline moved out of the Beacon Hill townhouse and into a 3-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in Somerville. The apartment had large windows, a clawfoot tub in the bathroom, crown molding that was slightly uneven in the living room, which she liked. It was imperfect in a way that was honest. No gardenias anywhere. It was 6 in the morning. Henny was asleep in the bassinet beside the bed. Caroline was at the kitchen table with her laptop, a cup of actual coffee she had discussed with her doctor, the return of caffeine with the formality of a legal negotiation, and the financial affidavit Grant's attorney had submitted the previous week. 23 pages, 11 asset categories. She had found 4 inconsistencies in 2 hours. She marked them in yellow, typed her notes in the margin, sent them to Marcus at 6:17 with a message. Pages 7, 14, 17, and 22. He's underreporting the Meridian account by approximately $400,000. I'm going to find the discrepancy document. Marcus replied at 7:45. I don't know what I would do with a less prepared client. Bill me accordingly, she wrote back. She was feeding Henty at 10:15 when the phone rang. Unknown number, Massachusetts area code, she answered. She always answered unknown numbers now. It was a new policy. Ms. Weston? This is she. My name is Vivian Hale. Caroline set down the burp cloth. She stood very still for a moment. I know who you are, she said. I know. I'm sorry. I know you have no reason to speak with me. A pause. The voice on the other end was carefully composed, but there was something underneath it. Something that sounded less like calculation and more like someone who had been awake for a long time. I've retained my own attorney. I've ended things with Grant. I wanted you to know that. Caroline waited. There are also financial documents, Vivian said, that he sent me, for safekeeping, through the firm's private server. I don't think I should have them. I think you should. What kind of documents? The Cambridge property, and 2 others that haven't been disclosed. A condo in Newport and a property in Vermont. 3 properties. Not 1. 3. Of course, Caroline thought. Of course there are more. She made the decision in approximately 3 seconds. Give me the name of your attorney, she said. That evening, she called Dr. Shore, not for a session, just to talk. Dr. Shore had told her at the end of their second meeting that this was allowed. A brief call, not a session, just to decompress. Vivian Hale called me today, Caroline said. How did that feel? Dr. Shore asked. Clarifying, Caroline said. She's not who I expected. Who did you expect? Caroline thought about this. Someone simpler, she said. A caricature, a villain. That would have been easier. And instead she's a 26-year-old who was also lied to, Caroline said, who asked him directly whether I knew. Who kept evidence she could easily have destroyed? And who called me? What do you make of that? I make of it that Grant told 2 women 2 different stories about the same marriage, she said, and both of us believed him, because both of us were dealing with a very skilled and practiced liar. A pause. There's something almost clarifying about that, she said. The scale of the lie, the architecture of it. He didn't just lie to me. He lied to everyone, all the time, in every direction. It was a complete system. What does that change for you? It changes the story I've been telling myself, she said. The one where I missed the signs because I was naive, or because I wasn't paying attention. The signs were there. I did notice them. But the system was specifically constructed so that noticing led nowhere. That's an important distinction, Dr. Shore said. Yes, Caroline said. It means I wasn't foolish. I was contained. Those are very different things. That night, after Henny was asleep, Caroline sat in the kitchen. The wall across from her was blank, white and unadorned. She had not hung anything yet. The apartment was 5.5 weeks old. She kept meaning to do something about the walls, but tonight she looked at the blank wall and thought, I like it. I like that it hasn't been decided yet. She thought about every wall in the Beacon Hill townhouse. How every decision had been made collaboratively, which in practice had meant made by Grant with her agreement sought afterward. The art he had chosen, the furniture she had adapted to, the life that had been assembled around her while she stood inside it and called it hers. I wore the perfect wife like a costume, she thought, and I wore it so well for so long that I forgot I had it on. He didn't take the costume off me. I walked around in it voluntarily, because somewhere along the way it became easier to be the costume than to look for what was underneath. She picked up the photograph on the counter. Law school graduation. 25 years old. Squinting against the sun. Holding the diploma with both hands, just slightly tighter than necessary. The look of someone who knows exactly what they worked for and intends to keep it. That woman was formidable, she thought. She still is. She was just waiting for the right reason. She baked her mother's cornbread. 10 o'clock at night. She had no particular reason. The craving came from somewhere older than hunger. The recipe was on a folded card in Ruth's handwriting, tucked into the back of a notebook she had carried since college. Cornmeal, buttermilk, 2 eggs, cast iron skillet. She got the skillet from the cabinet, the one her mother had given her as a housewarming gift when she married Grant. It had sat in the Beacon Hill kitchen, mostly unused. She had brought it with her when she left, wrapped in a dish towel, placed at the top of the box. She mixed the batter, the apartment filled with the smell of something honest. Cornbread in a cast iron skillet. The smell of Sunday mornings in Indiana, in a house where nobody had gardenias and everything was plain and true and warm. Henny's baby monitor sat on the counter. The soft, steady sound of Henny breathing, flour on Caroline's forearms, the sound of batter hitting the hot skillet, the smell of butter and cornmeal and something she could only call home, in the original sense. The one that was hers before anyone else had any claim on it. She ate the cornbread at the kitchen island, still in the cast iron pan, with butter and a glass of milk, the whole pan. Ruth would be proud, she thought, or horrified. Basically the same thing. Before bed, she stood in the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror. Not in the way she used to, the checking for deficiencies inventory that had become automatic, just looking. The hardest part is admitting I knew, she said. She met her own eyes. I knew for a long time. I knew in my body. In the part of me that went quiet when he walked in the room, the part that learned to make itself smaller and smaller until it could disappear into the furniture. A pause. That part is not small anymore. She turned off the bathroom light. She slept well. The deposition room was in a building on State Street, 14 floors up. Beige carpet. A long conference table of that specific corporate mahogany that cost a great deal and said nothing. Fluorescent lighting that nobody had ever described as flattering. Grant sat across from Caroline and Marcus, flanked by 2 attorneys. He was wearing a dark suit. His posture was correct and slightly formal, the posture of a man who had been in rooms like this before. He had not been in a room like this with Caroline before. Marcus began, patient, sequential. He walked Grant through the asset list, the LLC structure, the Cambridge apartment. He was thorough and unhurried in a way that was its own form of pressure. Grant answered smoothly. Coached. The measured performance of a man with very good legal representation and a carefully curated version of events. Then Marcus nodded to Caroline. She opened the folder in front of her. Mr. Weston, she said. Not Grant. Mr. Weston. The shift in register was exact and deliberate, and she could see him register it. I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit F, the LLC filing dated 14 months ago. I'm aware of that document, he said. Can you describe the stated purpose of WC7 for the record? Client entertainment, he said. Is a residential lease a standard format for client entertainment purposes within your firm? His attorney. Objection. Calls for speculation. He can answer from personal knowledge of his own firm's practices, Caroline said. The attorney looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at his notes with the expression of someone very interested in his notes. It depends on the arrangement, Grant said. I see. And was the arrangement at the Cambridge property specifically designated for client entertainment purposes in any internal documentation? I would need to review. You don't have access to that documentation? I'd need time to review it. You created the LLC? She said. You signed the lease. You paid the monthly expenses. You don't recall whether you designated it for client entertainment. A beat. I'd need to review the document, he said again. She waited. The wait itself was a question. Let me rephrase, she said. To your knowledge, did company funds contribute to expenses related to your personal relationship with Vivian Hale? His attorney. Objection, he can answer, Caroline said. The attorney looked at Grant. Grant looked at Caroline. He was waiting. She recognized the wait. She had seen it 100 times in their marriage. The specific pause before she backed down, before she softened, before she said something that allowed him to redirect. She did not back down. She did not soften. She waited. He's looking for the woman he prepared for, she thought. The one who made herself smaller, the one who accommodated, the one who found his explanations just plausible enough. She's not here today. Grant's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. To my knowledge, he said carefully, the company accounts reflect all legitimate business expenditures. That's not what I asked, she said. She turned to the next page in her folder. She felt, rather than saw, the shift in the room. After the deposition in the elevator, Marcus exhaled, one quiet breath, the only visible expression of the past 4 hours. That was excellent, he said. It wasn't personal, she said. It was evidence. For what it's worth, he said. His own attorney didn't know about the offshore account. You could see it in his face when it came up. I saw it. What do you want to do next? I want to go home and feed my daughter, she said. And then I want to prepare for the settlement hearing. Marcus nodded. His attorney called me this morning, he said, before the deposition. They want to settle. Of course they do, she said. They've seen what we have. The offer is... Don't tell me yet, she said. He looked at her. Whatever it is, it's not enough, she said. I want to hear it in the room, with him present. So he's there when I say no. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You know, he said. I've been practicing for 21 years. I've had a lot of clients. And I've never had one prepare a 17-page financial analysis of their own marital assets before our second meeting. She looked at him. I had 3 years of quarterly filings, she said, and a lot of nights in the nursery. He smiled, just barely. The professional equivalent. 2 days before the settlement hearing, Brooke Weston sent a text. I need to talk to you, not about the case, about something else. Caroline considered the message for 24 hours. Then she agreed to meet. A coffee shop in Somerville. Not Eleanor's neighborhood, not hers, neutral ground. Brooke arrived looking like she had not slept in several days. She sat down across from Caroline and ordered nothing and looked at her hands on the table. He's done this before, she said. Caroline waited. Before you. There was a woman he was engaged to, 5 years before you met. He left her when she got pregnant. A pause. She miscarried. He's never spoken about it, not to anyone. Why are you telling me this? Caroline said. Brooke wrapped her hands around the edge of the table. Because I helped him, she said. The first time, I helped him. I was 22 and I thought I was being loyal to my brother, and then, when he came to me this time, I helped him again. Because I didn't know how to be different. She looked up. I'm telling you because I want to be different now. I don't know if it matters, but I want to try. Caroline looked at her across the table. She thought about several things at once. About Brooke at 22, helping her brother with something she probably knew was wrong. About Brooke now at 36, carrying it. About the fact that people are sometimes terrible and sometimes trying and sometimes both at the same time. It matters, she said finally, because Henny has an aunt. That doesn't have to disappear because her father made terrible choices. Brooke looked up. But I need honesty, Caroline said. Not just now, from now on, going forward. Yes, Brooke said. Immediately, yes. All right, Caroline said. Then we start from here. They sat for a few more minutes. They did not speak much. There was not much to say yet. They were at the beginning of something, and beginnings don't require a lot of words. They just require a decision. The night before the settlement hearing, Henny was asleep in her room. Ruth was in the guest room, reading. Dee was on the couch, watching something she would not remember later. Caroline sat at the kitchen table with the settlement documents. She read every line, made notes in the margin, folded the corner of page 11. She looked at the blank wall, except it was not blank anymore. That morning she had gotten up early and hung one thing on it. The graduation photograph, 25 years old, squinting against the sun, holding the diploma with both hands, just slightly too tight. She looked at that woman for a long time. Okay, she thought. Tomorrow. Tomorrow we find out exactly what everything was worth. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a downtown building. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A view of the harbor. The water was gray and flat this time of year. Honest. Grant's lead attorney was already there when Caroline and Marcus arrived. His name was Bennett Cole, and he was the kind of attorney who wore his suit like armor. Practiced. Assured. Grant arrived 2 minutes later. Dark suit. Controlled posture. He looked at Caroline when he entered. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. They sat down. Bennett Cole opened his folder. He laid out the offer. It was substantial, by any ordinary measure, By the measure of a woman who did not yet understand the full scope of what had been hidden, it would have sounded like an ending. Marcus looked at Caroline. She looked at the harbor. "No," she said. Grant's head moved slightly. His attorney continued. "Ms. Weston, my client is offering he has 3 undisclosed properties," she said. "A condo in Newport, a property in Vermont, and the Cambridge apartment. He has an offshore trust account that does not appear in the discovery documents I have received. We have documentation for all 4. She opened her folder, slid a document across the table. "This is a summary schedule I prepared. Every line is supported by documentation in your possession as of last Wednesday." Bennett Cole looked at the document, looked at Grant, looked back at the document. "I'd like to request a brief recess. You can review the schedule now," Marcus said pleasantly. "We're happy to wait." A silence, the kind that fills a room the way water fills a low space, completely, inevitably. Bennett Cole reviewed the document. He was good at his face, but there was a moment, at the 3rd page, where the face slipped slightly. Just for a second, Grant was watching Caroline. She was watching the harbor. He's still waiting, she thought. He is still, even now, waiting for the version of me he prepared for. The one who would look at a large enough number and say, "That's enough. That's fine. I'll take it. She's not here. She never was." Bennett Cole set down the document. "My client would like to discuss the offshore account separately," he said. "No," Caroline said. A pause. "The offshore account is the anchor point," she said. "Without it, the other assets float free of their actual valuations. They're interconnected. The number on that schedule reflects the complete, accurate value of the marital estate. It's not punitive. It's mathematical." "Ms. Weston, if you're willing to negotiate on the offshore, I'm not," she said. She said it the way she used to say things in a courtroom. Not loudly, not with visible emotion, with a flatness that left no room for a different interpretation. Marcus was looking at his folder. He was entirely expressionless. Grant had not looked away from her. She met his eyes. "I know what you're doing," she thought. "You're looking for a crack. You're looking for the moment I hesitate. You've been looking for it since the deposition, and you haven't found it. You're not going to find it today. Your client's choices are the number on that schedule," she said, "or a trial where the misconduct evidence, the hidden assets, and the offshore account become public record. Your client has a public profile in a business that runs on investor confidence." A pause. Your client can choose. A long silence. Bennett Cole leaned over and spoke quietly to Grant. Grant did not look at his attorney. He looked at the harbor. He was very still. Then he said something Caroline had not expected him to say. His voice was quiet, almost without inflection. "All right," he said. "So, 2 words, just that." Bennett Cole turned to look at his client, the look of a man recalibrating. Grant picked up a pen. He held it over the document. He looked at Caroline one more time. "You prepared this yourself," he said. "Yes," she said. "The schedule, the offshore analysis, the property valuations." "Yes." He looked at it for a moment longer. Then he signed. Outside in the hallway, Marcus walked beside her toward the elevator. He was quiet, the satisfied quiet of a man who has done his job and done it well. He agreed to all of it, he said. "Yes," she said. "Every line. Every line." The elevator arrived. They stepped in. As the doors closed, Marcus said, "For what it's worth, that was one of the cleaner settlements I've seen in a very difficult case." "It wasn't clean because of luck," she said. "It was clean because I had documentation." "Yes," he said. "You did." The doors opened on the lobby. She stepped out into the marble and the recirculated air and the quiet hum of a downtown building going about its business on an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing about this day was ordinary, but the building didn't know that. The lobby didn't know that. The revolving door did not pause as she walked through it. The world kept moving, exactly as it always had, while inside her something settled into its right place with the quiet certainty of something that had been shifted for a very long time. She was walking to the car when she heard her name. "Carolyn." She stopped. Grant was behind her. He had come out after her without his attorneys. He was standing on the sidewalk in the sharp March air, without his armor on, or as much of it as he was capable of removing. He looked like a man. Just a man. Not a position, or a performance, or a carefully constructed presentation. A 38-year-old man standing on a sidewalk who had just watched the version of his life he had carefully managed fall through his hands. "For what it's worth," he said. "I am sorry." She stopped walking. She considered him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with something more like clear-eyed recognition. A seeing of what was actually there, without the overlay of what she had once needed it to be. "I know," she said, "but sorry, doesn't go backwards. It can only go forward." "What does that mean?" "It means be a good father to Henny," she said. "Be present when you say you will be. Be honest with her. Show up." A pause. That's what sorry looks like going forward. That's the only version that matters. He nodded. She stepped forward. She got in the car, the door closed. She sat with her hands in her lap, music off, windows down. The cold March air came through the windows, sharp and clean and very real. She did not cry. She was not triumphant, exactly. There was no surge of the feeling she had been told by movies and by the general cultural narrative of these situations she was supposed to feel. What she felt was simpler. She felt like herself. Fully, completely, without the costume, without the accommodation, without the performed calm or the deliberate smallness. Just herself in a car in the cold air on a Tuesday afternoon. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would, she thought. It feels better. It feels like actual air. Her phone rang. Ruth, she answered. How did it go? Her mother asked. Good, she said. It went good. How good? She almost smiled. Get the sparkling cider, she said. The expensive kind. I'm coming home. She heard her mother laugh, full and warm. The laugh of a woman who raised her daughter to be exactly this and has been waiting patiently for the world to see it. I'll put Henny in her good outfit, Ruth said. She's 6 weeks old, Mom. She doesn't have a good outfit. I found one at the consignment shop last week, Ruth teased. Don't tell me about parenting, Caroline laughed. A real one. From somewhere deeper than amusement. From somewhere that had been closed for a long time and was open now. She put the car in drive. She went home. Home was a 3-bedroom apartment with large windows and a clawfoot tub and a slightly uneven crown molding in the living room that she had come to think of as a personality trait. Home was flour on the kitchen counter that she had not cleaned up yet from the cornbread 2 nights ago. Home was Henny's playmat in the middle of the living room floor, taking up more space than it needed to, because Caroline had put it in the center of the room deliberately, to remind herself that this was a place where things were not arranged for appearances. Home was Ruth in the kitchen with sparkling cider and 4 glasses because she had invited herself to stay for dinner, which was what Ruth did. Dee was on the floor beside the playmat. Henny was on her back, looking at her own hands with the expression of someone encountering a fascinating stranger. Dee looked up when Caroline came in. Well, she said. All of it, Caroline said. Dee stared. All of it, she repeated. Every line of the schedule. Dee stood up. She crossed the room and hugged Caroline, hard and long. The hug of someone who has been carrying guilt for 8 months and has been given somewhere to set it down. Caroline hugged her back. The full weight of it, the real version. I love you, Dee said into her shoulder. I should have told you everything the moment I found out. I should have. You should have, Caroline agreed. But you showed up. You sat on my floor for a month. You cried at the birth of my daughter and didn't even pretend you weren't crying. A pause. That counts for something. Does it count for a lot? It counts for a lot, Caroline said. Ruth came in from the kitchen with the cider. She handed glasses to Caroline and Dee. She looked at her daughter the way she had been looking at her since she arrived in Boston, with the particular expression of a woman who has known, all along, exactly what her child was capable of, and has simply been waiting for the child to arrive at the same understanding. She did not say anything elaborate. She was not an elaborate person. She raised her glass. To Henny, she said. To Henny, said Caroline and Dee. They drank. On the playmat, Henny grabbed one of her own fingers and looked at it with profound satisfaction. The expression of someone who has just solved a significant problem. She's going to be a lawyer, Dee said. She's going to be whatever she wants, Caroline said. That is entirely the point. She called Marcus the next morning. The custody arrangement is finalized, he said. Joint legal. Primary physical with you. Scheduled visitation for Grant, standard terms, with flexibility built in for your travel schedule. My travel schedule, she said. You mentioned you're returning to practice, he said. I assumed a travel schedule was appropriate. Yes, she said. It is. A pause for what it's worth, Marcus said. I had a referral come across my desk this morning. A woman in a financial dispute with her husband. Complex asset structure. Some prenuptial questions. And I thought of you, he said. If you were interested in consulting while you're finding a firm. She considered this for a moment. Send me the file, she said. 3 weeks later, she had an offer from a firm in Cambridge. A small firm. 7 attorneys. They specialized in family law and financial litigation. High conflict cases. Cases involving women navigating asset structures designed to disadvantage them. Cases involving prenuptial agreements that had been constructed, as one of the founding partners put it, to silence rather than to protect. The founding partner said this during the interview. She said it looking directly at Caroline, without any particular drama, as a statement of the firm's philosophy. Caroline looked at her. I know exactly what those look like from the inside, she said. The partner nodded. That's why we called you, she said. She told Henny that evening, while feeding her. She told her about the job, about the firm, about the kind of work she was going to do. Henny was not particularly interested in the details. She was 6 weeks old, and her concerns were immediate and physical, and she communicated them with great clarity. But Caroline told her anyway, because it mattered that she said it out loud. Because it made it real in a way that paper and agreements and signed documents could not quite accomplish. I used to be very good at this, she said to Henny, and then I stopped. Not because I wanted to, because someone needed me to. And I let that be more important than what I needed. Henny looked at her. I'm not going to do that again, she said, for a lot of reasons. But one of them is you. She settled Henny against her shoulder, felt the small breath against her neck. You are going to watch me have a life, she said, a real one, with work that matters and friends who tell the truth and a house where the walls have things on them that I actually chose. A pause. And someday, when you are grown and in a situation where someone is asking you to be smaller, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about the fact that I was 32 years old and 8 months pregnant, and I figured out how to be myself again. Henny yawned, a spectacular, unhurried yawn. If I can do it, Caroline said, you can absolutely do it. 1 year later, a courtroom in Cambridge. Not a large one. A middle-sized room with good natural light and a judge who had a reputation for patience and precision. The kind of courtroom Caroline had dreamed about in her first year of practice before the dream was put in storage. She was at the plaintiff's table. Beside her was a woman named Paula, 38 years old, 2 children. A marriage of 12 years to a man with a complex holding structure and a prenuptial agreement that had been constructed, in her attorney's words, to shelter rather than to share. Across the table, opposing counsel was young and confident, well-dressed, the kind of assured that comes from not yet having met the person across the table. He spread his hands. My client's prepared to offer the following terms, he said. He read the terms. They were not terrible terms. They were designed to sound generous. They were designed to look to someone who had not done the work like a reasonable ending. Caroline waited until he finished. Your client's offer does not reflect the actual value of the marital estate, she said. I've prepared a supporting schedule. Every line is documented. Your client's counsel received the underlying materials last Thursday. The attorney blinked. I'd like to take a brief recess to consult. Of course, Caroline said. She clicked her pin, set it on the table, folded her hands. Paula leaned over. Is it always like this? She whispered. When you're prepared, Caroline said. Yes. It usually is. Paula nodded, something in her shoulders settling, the particular relaxation of someone who's been afraid for a long time and has just remembered they're not alone. Caroline recognized that feeling. She had felt it once in a different courtroom. A different case. A version of herself that was returning from storage, one day at a time, finding her way back to the light. That evening. Home. Henny had learned to walk sometime in the last 2 weeks. The walking was still theoretical in places, more of an aggressive lurch in a preferred direction, but she committed to it fully and without apparent concern for the inevitable interruptions. She fell, she got up, she fell again. She laughed. She had not yet learned that falling was supposed to be embarrassing. No one had told her yet. She had not absorbed the cultural consensus that going down in public was something to recover from, to excuse, to minimize. She just fell and got up and went where she was going. Caroline watched her from the couch. She thought about the woman in the Beacon Hill closet, the woman running cold water over her wrists at midnight, the woman lying in the dark, eyes closed, hands fisted under the sheet, performing sleep. That woman was not weak, she thought. She was inside a structure built to contain her. A structure of small accommodations and reasonable explanations in the patient erosion of everything she had once been. Structures can be dismantled. You just have to remember you knew how. Henny reached the far wall, turned, surveyed the distance back to the center of the room with an expression of serious assessment. Then she launched herself back across the rug, fell halfway, got up, and arrived at the playmat with great personal satisfaction. She looked at Caroline. Caroline looked at her. Go, she thought. Go and be exactly who you are. Don't wait for anyone's permission. Don't make yourself smaller to fit someone else's plan. Fall. Get up. Keep going. That's the whole lesson. That's everything I know. There was a letter on the kitchen counter. She had been saving it. Not intentionally. It had arrived 4 days ago, and she had set it on the counter and walked past it several times a day. She picked it up now. It was on Massachusetts Bar Association letterhead. A standard form letter. The kind that confirmed, in the language of bureaucracies, to something that was actually quite large. The formal reinstatement of her license to practice law in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, effective immediately. All fees paid, all requirements satisfied. She read it once. Then she folded it carefully, the way she had been taught to fold important documents. The way she had learned in a law firm a long time ago, before the leave, before the storage, before the years of costume and accommodation. She placed it on the counter. She looked at the wall, the graduation photograph, the woman with the diploma, squinting against the light, holding on. She looked at Henny on the playmat, talking to her own feet in the serious language of someone who has opinions. She looked at the kitchen with the uneven crown molding and the cast iron skillet and the flour she still had not entirely wiped off the counter. She looked at all of it, her life, actually, truly, completely hers. Well, she said, to herself, to Henny, to the room, to no one in particular, to the woman in the photograph and the woman she had become and the woman she was still becoming. There I am. End. Story complete, approximate word count, 21,400 words, 10 chapters, 100 minutes, 7 emotional layers all present. The title's promise fully delivered.
You just heard the story of Caroline Adler, a woman who gave up a career, gave up her independence, gave up slowly and quietly the shape of herself, one small accommodation at a time, and when the worst happened, when the man she trusted most made a choice that should have ended her, she did not fall apart. She got to work, and I want to spend a few minutes with you now. Not to summarize what happened, you heard it, you felt it. I want to talk about what it means. The first thing this story teaches us is this. Losing yourself is rarely dramatic. It doesn't happen in one moment. It doesn't look like a disaster. It looks like reasonable. It looks like, of course, if that's what you think. It looks like, I suppose that makes sense. It looks like 100 small yeses to things that slowly, quietly rearrange who you are. Caroline did not wake up one day and decide to disappear. She woke up one day and realized she already had. And that is the thing no one warns you about. Not the obvious betrayal, the invisible one, the one you participate in, the one that happens so gradually that by the time you notice, you have forgotten what you looked like before it started. If any part of Caroline's story felt familiar, if you recognized something in the way she went quiet, in the way she made herself smaller, in the way she accommodated and adjusted and performed a version of happiness that was just plausible enough to maintain, then this story was written for you. You are not alone in that recognition. And here is what Caroline's story tells us about what comes next. The second thing this story teaches us is that capability does not expire. Caroline set her law degree aside for 7 years. 7 years without a courtroom, without a case, without the version of herself that was sharpest, most alive, most fully present. And when she needed it, it was there, waiting, like a held breath. She did not have to rebuild herself from nothing. She had to remember what was already there, under the costume, under the accommodation, under the version of herself that had been shaped by someone else's needs. It was still there. It is still there in you too. Whatever you set aside, whatever you were told was impractical or inconvenient or too much, whatever quiet capability you have been carrying without using, it has not gone anywhere. It has been waiting. The question is not whether you still have it. The question is, what would happen if you stopped pretending you don't? The third thing this story teaches us, and perhaps the most important, is about the difference between revenge and reclamation. Caroline did not want Grant to suffer. She said it directly in that conference room when Marcus asked her. She did not want punishment. She wanted her life back, her career, her daughter raised in honesty, her walls with her own things on them, her mornings with purpose. That distinction matters enormously, because the culture around stories like this one often tells us that the goal is to win against the person who hurt us, to make them pay, to watch them fall. And there is satisfaction in that. We are human. It is human to want it. But Caroline teaches us something deeper. She teaches us that the real victory is not what happens to him. It is what happens to her. The return to the courtroom, the blank wall that she fills with her own choices, the cast iron skillet and the cornbread and the sound of her daughter's breathing, the morning she wakes up and feels, for the first time in years, entirely present in her own life. That is the victory that lasts, not his collapse, her return, and the final lesson, the one that Henny teaches us without saying a single word. She falls. She gets up. She falls again. She laughs. She has not yet learned that falling is supposed to be embarrassing. She has not yet absorbed the idea that going down means something is wrong with you, that you should recover quickly and quietly and hope no one noticed. She just falls and gets up and keeps going. At what point did we unlearn that? At what point did falling become something to hide rather than something to move through? Caroline spent 7 years performing a version of herself that never fell, that smiled through everything, that held herself so carefully upright that the effort of staying upright became the whole of her life. And then she stopped. She fell, very publicly, very completely, and she got up. And what she became on the other side of falling, that is not a smaller version of who she was before. It is the full version, the real one, the one that was always there, waiting for the right reason. So if you are in the middle of a fall right now, if you are in the part of the story that feels like it is not going to resolve, I want you to hear this. You are not at the end. You are in the middle. And the middle is not where the story ends. Caroline was in the closet with a 4-word note